What is up, you guys? I'm Sid, and today we are going to be talking about animals' menstrual cycles. What kind of animals have periods? Because I just assumed it was just about all mammals, but I was so wrong. Let's get into this research. My last video I posted was on the gestation period, like how long certain animals are pregnant for, and then that got me thinking about menstruation. Humans' menstrual cycles are 28 days linked up with the moon. Like, I have my period just about every new moon, and I ovulate just about every full moon. Sometimes it switches up a little bit if the cycles are out of whack, but my period is linked up with the moon. And you always hear people say, if it wasn't for periods, you wouldn't be here. So I guess I just kind of assumed that animals had periods too. I had a friend down the street who had a dog, and I remember I was like, why the heck is your dog wearing a diaper? And my friend, who at the time was like, I don't know, 10 years old, was like, oh, she's on her period. And I was like, oh, okay. I think that experience just kind of had me assume that dogs had periods and that all of these other animals have periods, but that's not true. It's actually really rare to menstruate in terms of being an animal because most animals do not. We'll get into the whole dog thing later. It's not a real period. It's something sort of similar, but we'll talk about that at the end. So first, I want to talk about animals who genuinely menstruate. There's only a handful of monkey species who have a 28-day menstrual cycle, and I cannot pronounce the names, but I'll put cute little pictures of them up and the names up. A lot of different types of monkeys, apes, that kind of family menstruate, which would make sense because they're the most similar to humans. Their gestation period is also sort of similar to humans, and their menstrual cycle length is comparable to humans, but it is usually not the typical 28 days like humans and like these just handful of monkey species. Orangutans have menstrual cycles of about 29 days. Apes and gorillas, 30 to 32 days. Baboons have cycles of about 30 to 35 days. Bonobos are about 32 to 35 days. Chimpanzees, it's 37 days. So comparable, but a bit longer. Like, it's not linked up with the moon like humans. Although I wonder if it was linked up with the moon like back in the day when the moon was closer to the Earth. Would that make sense? I don't know. Anyways, let's get back to the facts. Fruit bats, black mastiff bats. Bats' menstrual cycles are 33 days, and they usually only bleed for one of those days. Long-tongued bats have a cycle of about 22 to 26 days. Also, in case you're wondering how long bats are pregnant for, some it's like 6 to 9 weeks, however, some can be up to 7 months. Varies depending on species. And also the spiny mouse, which was discovered in 2017 and was a really big deal. They also have menstrual cycles too, and they have a period. So basically, it's humans, types of monkeys, not all types of monkeys because lemurs don't menstruate, but humans, most types of monkeys, some bats, and then some other little things like the spiny mouse. There's other species that sort of menstruate, like they shed the lining of the womb, but they don't bleed until the end of the breeding season, which would happen like once a year. The elephant shrew does that. It's not an elephant, it's this little guy right here. I'll put a picture up of. So yeah, besides that, we really only got a few species who menstruate. I want to talk about this spiny mouse that was discovered in 2017 though, because its menstrual cycle is only like 6 to 10 days with an average of 8 days, and 3 of those days are when they bleed. So this would totally suck, okay? Because humans, I mean, we have a 28-day cycle, and then we're bleeding for like maybe 5 days out of those 28 days, but this little mouse has like an 8-day cycle and it's bleeding for 3 of those days. So it has 3 days of bleed time, 5 days of free time, 3 days of bleed time, 5 days of free time. Humans usually have like 21 or 23 days of free time and then like 5 or 7 days of bleed time. There's some girls who only bleed for like 3 days. So that I don't even want to comprehend because that's just wild. When I read that the cycles were like 8 days with an average of 3-day bleed time, some people reading that, especially maybe some men who don't fully comprehend it, or just women who haven't given birth yet, would think that you have like 8 days in between. but no, that's only like 4 or 5 days in between. And I think the thing that allows you to fully comprehend reading that sentence is having had a child, because you hear in health class all the time that when a woman is in labor and her contractions get to be like 2 minutes apart or 1 minute apart, that's when things are really getting real. But I feel like they don't emphasize enough what that means, the mathematics of that. Because if your contractions are 1 minute apart, that does not mean that you have 1 minute in between contractions. No, because contractions last for like 50 seconds. So what that means is you have 10 seconds in between the pain of this contraction before the next contraction starts, because contractions are measured from the start of one contraction to the start of the next contraction. But there's 50 seconds of contraction within that time period, so you really only have 10 seconds to try to switch position before the pain starts again. I didn't realize that until I was having a baby. That was a total side note, but I feel like it kind of goes into this conversation. Anyways, let's just mention that there's not a ton of research on this topic of animals menstruating, okay? Sure, animals in captivity, we can kind of monitor and see and observe their menstrual cycles, okay? Because we have gorillas in zoos, etc. But also, the gorillas in zoos are going to menstruate more than gorillas in the wild, because beings who are starving are not going to menstruate. Even humans who are starving are not going to menstruate, meaning that they won't bleed really, but they also won't ovulate because their body knows that it cannot even sustain themselves. So how could it get pregnant and sustain a baby? So animals in the wild who are starving will not menstruate, or will not menstruate as often. Their cycles will be more irregular. But animals in captivity are more likely to have a healthy and regular menstrual cycle because they're being well fed. Depending on how well they're being cared for, if they're in a really stressful situation, like some kind of unethical zoo, maybe that stress is going to affect their menstrual cycle. But if they're in a really nice chimpanzee sanctuary or something, they're getting the good food, they're going to have a nice healthy menstrual cycle. So of course that's a factor, but also just the fact that we really haven't studied this much, because most researchers back in the day were like rich white men. Why would they care to research about animals' menstrual cycles? They would probably think it's gross. I listened to a YouTube video on this whole subject. I'll link it in the description of this video because I got a lot of my information from that video. I thought it was extremely interesting. But one of the things they mentioned that I thought was just really funny, total side topic, but they were like, oh yeah, this is kind of like the story of when they sent 1,000 tampons for a week trip to outer space or something for like the female astronaut that was going, because the people who were packing her stuff were guys. They had no clue how many tampons she needed for a week, so they just sent like 1,000. I don't know if this story's true or not. I don't know if outer space is real or not, but regardless, I thought that was pretty freaking funny. Really only need like 30, but they sent 1,000. And like I said, this hasn't been researched a ton, but it said that some species with like a higher versus lower class system, the lower class won't menstruate, or won't menstruate as much as the higher class, or like the lower class won't menstruate at all and the higher class will. I thought that was just wild. Like, how does the body know to do that? Just so mind-boggling to me. Now let's talk about the alternatives. Like, what do these other animals do that don't menstruate? So by now we should know that menstruating is like the shedding of the lining of the uterus when pregnancy does not occur. In most mammals, the uterine lining is like reabsorbed instead of shedding it out and bleeding. Most female mammals have an estrous cycle, I think that's how you say that, instead of a menstrual cycle, which prepares the uterus for pregnancy. So an estrous cycle is kind of like being in heat. You've probably heard that when talking about dogs or cats. But other animals do this too. In my last video, we talked about how long certain species of animals are pregnant for, and elephants are pregnant for a really long time. They also have the longest estrous cycle, 13 to 18 weeks. So females of most vertebrate species exhibit reoccurring periods of heightened sexual activity in which they are sexually attractive, perceptive, and receptive to males. This periodic sex appeal is referred to as heat or estrus. So let's talk about dogs, because I always thought dogs had a period because I saw my neighbor's dog wearing a diaper because she was bleeding, but they do not have menstrual cycles in the same way that humans do. Instead, they experience an estrous cycle going into heat, which is a reproductive cycle and makes them receptive to mating. But so the stages of estrus, first there's the proestrus, which is where this bloody discharge appears, okay? And the dog is not yet receptive to mating. And then the estrus stage, where the discharge becomes lighter and the dog is receptive to mating, and this is when ovulation occurs. Then there's the diestrus stage, which is where the discharge stops and the dog is no longer receptive to mating. If the dog is pregnant, then she will remain in diestrus until giving birth. And then there's the anestrus stage, which is a period of like inactivity between estrus cycles. Seems quite a lot like the diestrus stage to me, but there you go. Most dogs have 2 estrus cycles per year, about 6 to 7 months apart. However, some breeds could have only 1 cycle a year, or some breeds could have 3 cycles a year. The length of each cycle can vary, but the average duration is around 7 to 8 months. So basically, they're bleeding for 7 to 10 days is that proestrus stage where they're really bloody. And then there's another 5 to 10 days where it's lighter bleeding. And then the whole rest of that 6 to 7 months, they're not bleeding. Basically, if you have a female dog, you need to keep a diaper on them for 2 weeks every 7 months, it sounds like. I've never had a female dog, so I wouldn't know. If you guys have a female dog, did you know this or did you not? Let me know why and what your thoughts are in the comments down below. I also assumed that cats were probably like dogs because the two just tend to go hand in hand in a lot of conversations. However, it's really not. So cats, rabbits, and ferrets ovulate during sex. The sex triggers the ovulation, which was just mind-blowing to me. But I guess it makes sense. So let's talk about cats and their estrus cycle, but also keep in mind that they don't ovulate unless they're having sex. Like, the penetration of the sex is what triggers the egg to be released. Cats typically have multiple estrus cycles per year, usually between 2 and 4. Each cycle lasts around 7 to 10 days. But can vary. And if a cat does not mate during an estrus cycle, she will go into heat again after a short period of about 15 to 21 days. Estrus cycles typically occur during the spring and summer months, interesting, but can vary depending on climate. Estrus cycles can be very stressful for cats, especially if they are not allowed to mate. I had a female cat for a short amount of time, and I experienced her being in heat. She was obviously in a lot of discomfort and was just trying to fuck everything. She was trying to have sex with her brother. She was trying to have sex with the other boy cat who was already fixed. She was trying to have sex with the girl cat who was already fixed. She was just going crazy. So I got her fixed because I did not want inbred cat babies. But this other article says that each heat generally lasts several days, with the average length being 7 days, although it can range from 1 to 21 days of being in heat. That's wild. If the female cat is not mated during estrus, she will go out of heat for a short period of time, usually about 7 days, but it can range from 2 to 19 days. So no, cats typically do not bleed while in heat, unlike dogs. There may be some light spotting or discharge, but it is not significant bleeding. Like, they do not bleed like a dog does. Dogs are really unique because they bleed, but it isn't a period because it's not the lining of the uterus. It's just this bloody and then kind of watery discharge that means they're receptive to breeding. But yeah, I thought it was really interesting that cats, rabbits, are known for going at it, and ferrets ovulate during sex. It also says that female foxes will scream in heat, which, I feel like cats kind of do the same thing. But yeah, the more you know. Animals' menstrual cycles are not linked up with the moon like how humans are. There's a handful of monkeys who are linked up with the moon cycle, but really the only animals that menstruate are some species of apes, some species of bats, and then some species of rodents. That's it that we know of. Other mammals have this estrus cycle, which sounds super stressful, to be honest. I hope you guys found this interesting. If you haven't watched my other video on the length of pregnancy and its kind of spiritual deep correlation to the commitment level of that incarnation. You should check that video out. I'll leave it linked in the description of this video as well. Love you guys so much. Peace out.